morning. I'm Ken Bibrai, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. In the news today, FTX, a multi-billion-dollar crypto exchange, is on the verge of collapse. And in Georgia, the U.S. Senate race is heading to a December 6th runoff. Today's topic is Any Given Tuesday, a discussion about the results of the midterm elections and politics in general. We're joined by political strategist and author Lis Smith. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Congrats on the book. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, look, you named it Any Given Tuesday, and literally, I think the conventional wisdom coming into this past Tuesday was that there was going to be a massive red wave, no one would recover, all of this chaos. But we have reasons, just like we have sporting events, and anything can happen on any given day, right? So, what's your take on Tuesday?
Yeah. So, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm someone who did not expect. And look, we will end up having lost, a number of House seats. But it looks like we are in store for or on pace for the best performance for governors in a midterm, of the same party. We may hold the Senate. So that is obviously a lot better than a lot of people expected. And I did think I gave into some of the doom and gloom narrative. But the larger lesson I think that this tells us about the election is that the Republicans, this should have been a great year for the Republicans. Mm-hmm. All the fundamentals pointed toward a good year for them. If you looked at the top issues being inflation, gas prices, but they went out of their way to nominate candidates who were just so far outside the mainstream that independent voters couldn't break their way. So while they did fine with Republicans, what we saw at the last minute was in key races that independents broke toward Democrats. And it should be a wake-up call for the Republican Party, is that if they continue to try to be a party of Donald Trump, they will, continue to see significant setbacks like this at the ballot box.
Because there was like 300 January 6th election deniers who ran for office, right? So part of the main closing argument was kind of calling into question democracy in the election, right? So did that become a motivating factor, you think, for the independents?
So I don't know how much democracy was. I got to tell you, that was not really something that really popped up in polls. For people who made their decisions based on that issue, they're probably partisans. But an issue that a lot of people thought had really faded, that hadn't, was abortion. And abortion ended up being a massive driver in a lot of these elections in ways that we weren't really expecting. And certainly, I'm live from Detroit, Michigan here, and it was a massive factor here because they had an abortion ballot initiative. But it ended up being a big driver for independents across the country as well.
Well, you're in Michigan, right? You're spending some time there. Tell us about what you're spending your time on there. Some of the key races, the governor's race, the spread was, I think, much larger than people expected. We were chatting beforehand, even larger than the spread in New York, right?
Yes.
And Senate flipping. I mean, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground in Michigan.
Yeah, so it was great. And I had been hearing amazing things about how the turnout was going to be in Michigan for a while. And it was a lot. Everything I was hearing on the ground here was so much rosier than what I was hearing on the ground in New York, which is crazy. And so, one of the two things had to be wrong, but it turns out that they were actually both right. That they had a really, really good night in Michigan, and we had a not so great night in New York. So in Michigan, for the first time in 40 years, they were able to flip the state Senate. They also flipped the state House blue. So it is almost, it's been longer, certainly than my lifetime, that they've had a trifecta of having a Democratic governor, Democratic state Senate, Democratic state House. So that's going to be able to change how, the state is run. And Governor Whitmer is now going to be able to implement a Democratic agenda for the first time in 40 years, of any governor for the first time in 40 years. We also were able to hold our key battleground seats here, and pick up a key seat, the old Peter Meyer seat, Hillary Skolton won. So it helped offset some of our losses in New York, I'd say.
Fascinating. So look, you mentioned polling briefly, just taking a step back, right? I mean, we always kind of look at these polls, everyone pays attention to them. How valuable is polling today, right? I mean, we've seen a massive influx of young people really helping shape the results that came on Tuesday. So I want to hear your thoughts on young people and how maybe we were caught off guard by how motivated people were to show up and vote, but like polling and kind of tracking and engaging where we are on these elections, it just seems harder and harder every cycle.
Oh God, it sure does. And I've never been a big fan of the generic ballot test, right? Because ultimately I think these come down to individual races and individual choices that people have to make. But ironically, the generic ballot test ended up being pretty on the nose, right? And you saw it being pretty equal between Democrats and Republicans at the end, and that's what it looks like it's going to end up as in the House. Probably Republicans have a small edge over Democrats, and they win the House. But as for the other polls, yeah, I mean, we've seen for the last few cycles that there are massive problems with, and it seems like the main problem. There are two main problems for them. One is figuring out who is a likely voter, like what is the turnout going to look like. And in previous cycles, pollsters have very much underestimated what the Trumpy sort of rural red turnout's going to look like. And in this cycle, it does look like pollsters underestimated sort of the younger voter turnout. But the second problem is that these are people who also are less likely to pick up calls from pollsters. So you're not going to be able to really even reach them. And it just speaks to the challenges that pollsters face in that you can't just rely on calls, you got to do online as well. But it's really hard if you're in the prediction business and, no one really knows what the electorate's going to look like. And it also, for people who are consumers of polls, whether it's me, you, whoever's listening, is that to always take them sort of with a grain of salt. And I think looking at the aggregate of them is better than looking at any individual one. But there were polls that came out on election day here in Michigan that showed Tudor Dixon beating Gretchen Whitmer. And of course, Whitmer won handily by double digits. So another issue that we had this cycle was a flood of Republican polls. But going forward, I think it's incumbent upon people like us, but also media organizations to maybe just discount any of the polls that were massive outliers or that were clearly thrown into the mix to try to skew the aggregate.
Got it. So anytime a big election happens, you quickly look to the top, right? So like, what does this mean for President Biden? But also at the same time, what does it mean for former President Trump at a macro level?
Well, the opposite of what a lot of people were thinking, right? Remember on Monday evening, people were saying that Donald Trump was maybe going to announce for president. And as a way of sort of flooding the news zone and being able to take credit in advance for what was expected to be a good night for Republicans. It was not a good night. It was a mediocre night. It was a bad night in the sense that the expectations were set so high. But they still were able to pick up seats that will hurt us. But and it was a good night for Biden in a couple reasons. One, he beat the expectations game. Two, people did think it was a bloodbath and that he was on the ballot and he was going to be the biggest drag on candidates. And it turned out, yes, there are some areas where candidates were not going to be able to outrun him. But, and this goes into three, I think that it shows that the future of the Democratic Party is rooted probably more in the Biden wing than it is in like the far left wing. And that was something that he talked about a bit yesterday. The candidates that we saw outperform, the candidates that we saw succeed, were candidates that were more sort of in the Biden mold, the normie mold, and the candidates that could win over independents. So if you look at seats like in Pennsylvania with Fetterman, in Arizona, Nevada, which are still left to be called, but I've been hearing good things about them. In Georgia with Warnock, which is going to run off, although he ended up ahead of Walker and massively outran Stacey Abrams there. They're all candidates that won over independents. But when you look at candidates who weren't able to win independents, people like Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, who is more from the very progressive wing of the party, it says that the Biden mold, the Biden Democrat, is sort of the path forward for Democrats.
And you talk a little bit about it in your book, right? I think you avoid the term centrist, but you focus on reasonable candidates. Talk about that. How important is that authenticity, reasonabableness, thinking about the political spectrum and what resonates with broader sectors of voters?
Yeah, and to be clear, I think the main thing I talk about in my book, and I had a New York Times op-ed on Sunday on this topic,
Mhm.
is I say that there is no one way, no right way to be a Democrat. And there are going to be some districts where you will have extremely, extremely progressive people running because they are people who are in touch with the people they want to represent, in touch with their constituents. And that is a-okay. My point, though, is that we cannot apply all of those litmus tests, all of those progressive litmus tests to all of our candidates across the country. Because if you do that, that will be a death knell for them in states like Arizona, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, and Michigan, whatever it is. And we need to give candidates the space to break with party or orthodoxy on key issues. Like, for instance, Fetterman broke with the left on fracking. Um, uh, Mark Kelly in Arizona broke with his party on the border. And giving them the space to do that and not, yelling and shouting them down for them is how we will be able to be a majority party. I mean, as you know, let's look at a state like West Virginia. The left loves to beat up on Joe Manchin, but Joe Manchin is probably the last Democrat who's going to be, in the U.S. Senate from West Virginia. And if you think of West Virginia Democrats bad, wait till you see a West Virginia Republican.
Yeah. No, and it's funny you saw with Tim Ryan, right? I mean, one of his closing ads was, shooting the gun and saying not bad for a Democrat. I mean,
Yeah, and keep in mind, Tim Ryan lost, lost by like the same margin that like Kathy Hochul won by in New York. So he outran the top of the ticket by I think over 20 points, the gubernatorial race. So again, even though he's a candidate who didn't win, he way overperformed, expectations and overperformed what he should have. And not only that, because of how well he was doing, Republicans had to spend $30 million in Ohio. And so it might not be much consolation to Tim Ryan, but he likely saved us a Senate seat or two by taking that $30
sure.
million of spending.
Wow. And do you have any predictions on President Trump? Do you think he does move forward with an announcement? Is he, you see like the New York
Oh,
Post and you see Wall Street Journal today. There seems to be a lot of kind of pressure on and blame on him personally for getting so involved.
yeah. Oh, sorry, I forgot to answer that
No.
part of your question. So just as it was good for the narrative for Biden, and God knows how long that lasts. The media seems to um, have a lot of ADD in that sense. But with Donald Trump, no doubt that it's bad for his narrative. He was out there thinking it was going to be a great night for him. But if you look at the candidates that he endorsed, he was a massive boost to them in the primary, but then they were dead weight in the general election. If you like Herschel Walker in Georgia, Blake Masters in Arizona, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. I mean, it remains to be seen what will happen with Walker and with
Carrie Lake.
Walker. Yeah. There's Walker, Carrie Lake, but when we look at the other candidates, the gubernatorial candidates like Tudor Dixon in Michigan or Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, who is an absolute disaster of a candidate. Also, the gubernatorial candidates in both Maryland and Massachusetts. He ended up endorsing people sort of in his mold. And what I was saying about, one thing that I hope we can learn as Democrats, which is not to require every candidate to check every box on the litmus test. Trump was doing that with his candidates. He would not endorse people unless they endorsed the big lie, unless they said that the 2020 election was stolen. And it goes to show you that if you do sort of push these extreme litmus tests on people, it's something that will backfire with voters. So we have seen sort of some of the right-wing gatekeepers flee his camp a bit. And yesterday he was putting out these absolutely flailing statements. I don't know though. A lot of us said that he was done after January 6th, and he sure came roaring back. So it's on the Republican Party. It's on the leaders in the party to say no mas and to start breaking with them.
Yeah.
And we can't just rely on the New York Post and Fox News and stuff like that. It really will take the leaders in the Republican Party to do that.
So speaking of that, I mean, Kevin McCarthy, still an unknown. What tea leaves are you reading there? I mean, is he going to be the next speaker?
So, I mean, I don't have a lot of insight into internal GOP, House GOP politics, but no, again, not a great night for him. And I know that he had been planning to have this sort of blowout celebration on election night. They had like every national news outlet at his war room there, but then he ended up giving this sad, lukewarm speech, and it looks like there's a lot of dissatisfaction within their ranks. So, I expect the Republicans to have a majority, but it does seem like that there will be, various factions running to lead the House GOP going forward. And I would also say this is that if I were Kevin McCarthy, if I were the House GOP, I would probably rather be in the minority than have like a 3-5 seat majority, because then that means that they can, like Marjorie Taylor Greene can like hold them hostage over anything. And whereas when you're in the minority, you can at least just sit back, do nothing, and blame the Democrats for everything.
Yeah. No, so fascinating. Now, one of the kind of outcomes was this kind of pushback against the politics of fear, right? And I think one of the clients and candidates that you've been really supportive of, State Senator Mallory McMorrow in Michigan.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. I mean, like, she went viral, she resonated, she really kind of emerged as a leader not only in Michigan but beyond. I mean, how important is that kind of core root virtue values that she stands for, and what attracted you to her? What are your hopes and expectations?
Yeah. So, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. So she, in April, had a colleague, a Republican state senator, sent out a fundraising email that called Mallory a groomer and accused her of sexualizing children, all just because she stood up for, I don't know, trans kids or something like that. Mallory gave a speech where she pushed back and on the Senate floor and said, famously that hate won't win, but pointed out that the reason why people like this Republican state senator in Michigan were doing all these attacks, especially targeting, the trans community, is because, they wanted to sort of distract people and say, you need to hate this person rather than focusing on all the things that Republicans aren't doing. And so it went mega viral. And then Mallory used that moment to not just, ride her 15 minutes of fame, as politicians often do in these situations, but to start a movement to really help flip the Michigan State Senate. And she ended up raising, so the state senator who did that fundraising email raised $235 off of it. Mallory ended up raising over $2.5 million to flip the state Senate, which, as you know, for a state senator is like a bonkers amount of money. And it's really important here in Michigan because we have the DeVos family here, and they're known for just pouring millions and millions of dollars into Republican candidates. But with Mallory's fundraising, she was able to completely counteract that. And now, play a critical role in flipping the state Senate blue for the first time in 40 years. But what this race did show, what happened in Michigan and what happened elsewhere, although Michigan really was sort of ground zero for it, was that they put all their eggs in the basket here, the Republican Party did, of running ads mostly against trans people. If you were watching ads here, all the state Senate races were all about like gender theory. Even the abortion initiative, right? They said that if you supported the initiative here, which would overturn a 1931 ban on abortion, it would allow children to get access to puberty blockers and stuff like that. It was bonkers stuff. And the fact that it was so soundly rejected should be pretty encouraging, because it showed that people were not giving into these cynical attacks and, weren't giving into the politics of hate and fear and division.
Wow. One of the things that I loved, and I think you got a lot of credit for when you were advising then Mayor Pete on his presidential run, was this kind of go everywhere media strategy. Talk about that. I mean, is that something that was just unique to Pete? Is that what you kind of everybody? I mean, what's your communications approach for candidates when they're trying to raise their own profile?
Well, it certainly depends, right? It was an approach that was sort of tailor-made for Pete, because he is someone who is, I just think, the best TV communicator in the Democratic Party. He's very quick on his feet. He's just a really, really good in town halls and interviews. And so when he was running for president, when he first announced, he had no money, no fundraising base. I mean, we had, I think, 17,000 people total on our email list. He had absolutely no name ID, and on top of that,
And it's
like
super easy, right?
exactly, right? What I was about to say.
I feel his pain. I feel his pain.
Right. As you should. I know, but it's a distinctive. You can turn it into.
Yeah.
You can turn a tough last name, distinctive last name, into a positive. But with so no money, no name ID. The only way that, and there's a third way that you can sort of become big in these races, which is the media, and everyone has access to earned media, to the free press. And so what we decided to do was just say yes to, as many things as we could, and find opportunities for him to really break out there. Obviously, it was the CNN town hall in March of 2019 when he ended up on most radar screens and most people's radar screens, the mega viral moment. But we also made sure just to get him on as many podcasts as possible that reach as many different audiences. And we made sure to get him on, I put him on entertainment outlets, sports outlets, fashion outlets, celebrity gossip outlets. And like, when you think of fashion, celebrity gossip, and sports, probably Pete Buttigieg is the last person that comes to mind.
Yeah.
But we also made sure to put him on Fox News and more conservative media. And there's a big debate in the Democratic Party whether you should do that. And are you legitimizing Fox News? And my view on that is, Fox News is here to stay. But there are a lot of people who watch Fox News who are Democrats and independents, and we need to try to reach out to everyone. And when Pete, for instance, did his Fox News town hall in May of 2019, what we saw was the next day that MSNBC, CNN they were leading segments every hour with clips that had gone viral from Pete's Fox Town Hall. It was picked up across the media, all around the country. So what happens on Fox News doesn't stay on Fox News. But one thing I'd say is this: is not every candidate is quite built that way, and so people need to sort of figure out what works for them. But increasingly, we're seeing that people consume their news in very fractured ways. And if we want to be successful in reaching them, we can't just think that we go through the old gatekeepers and we'll be able to reach them.
Yeah. And he's clearly still taking your advice, because I saw him on a podcast with Drew Barrymore giving her dating advice. So it's clearly resonating. Taking a quick step back before we let you go, our electoral system, right? This is kind of consistent with Pete, a big thinker, right? Like, is how we run our elections flawed, right? Like these hard primaries that then kind of force candidates maybe too far left or too far right, versus systems like in Alaska or maybe ranked choice or other systems that were tested out in New York. Like, is there fundamental things we should change in our system to kind of get more candidates that may be more representative of the district or the community they represent?
Yeah, I do think so. I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting. I know that not everyone is, but I think ranked choice voting is something that where a system that is more likely to lead to more of a consensus candidate versus someone who can just get, if you have a multi-way primary, like where someone who's super extreme can get 30% of the vote. So yeah, I do think that ranked choice is really good. And speaking to your question, is that our primary system does create a lot of perverse incentives for people. Both on, certainly on both sides, although I would never equate, what happens on the left with what happens on the right. Yes, I do think that people sometimes on the far left espouse positions that are out of touch with the mainstream, but on the right, they're embracing conspiracy theories and violence and dangerous rhetoric. But it does sort of incentivize people just to run to the far extremes. And we have various other things in our political system that do that. The chase for small dollar donors. Everyone thought, okay, well, if we get rid of big money in politics, then it's going to be so great. But now we notice that there is a big problem. If all you're doing is trying to chase small dollar donations, that means that you are going to try to go out and say the most incendiary thing possible. And that's how you have people embrace conspiracy theories. People embrace, slogans that are frankly unhelpful, like defund the police, because if you say things like that, you are more likely to get small dollar donations. But that then leads to a complete polarization in our politics, and it's not helpful at all. So we do have to re-examine the way that we sort of do these things, and I think ranked choice is a very smart, practical approach that we can put into law.
Yeah. So you've been around a bunch of cycles, a bunch of campaigns around the country. Are you more optimistic or more pessimistic about politics in general? Do you still love it? I mean, what's your future hold?
Well, I think it's hard not to be pessimistic about politics when you see people like Trump out there, still hanging around. But I personally, I am very optimistic as well, because I get to see people like Mallory McMorrow up close. And the things that do make me the most optimistic about politics is when I see the new generation of elected officials coming up, the new generation of activists coming up, and some of the people who won re-election the other night, the Mallory McMorrows, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Lauren Underwood in Illinois, Sharice Davids in Kansas. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Mayor Pete's. It's hard when you see these people who have backgrounds in public service. Lauren Underwood was a nurse. Pete is a veteran, and we've got this amazing, next generation class of post 9/11 veterans. So it's hard not to feel a little optimistic when you see people like that. And I hope that we continue as a Democratic Party to try to recruit more people who come from these service-oriented backgrounds.
That's amazing. Well, Lis Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. Love the book. Appreciate you taking the time. Everybody tuning in, appreciate you being here. Next conversation is going to be with Trey Stevens, the executive chairman of Anduril. And you can visit coffeewithken.com to catch up on past sessions, or visit us on Spotify, Google Play, and iHeartRadio. Thanks so much, Lis.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, everyone.